Welcome and good morning. I think everyone is seated. So first I want to say thank you so much for taking the time, making the time today to actually come and nourish the spirit and soul. My name is Suhanya Rafael. I'm the director, the museum director at M+, and it is really fabulous to be welcoming you all as M+'s female director. And a South Asian Australian now living in Hong Kong. So really, this is an event, M Plus Matters that is focusing on conversations on women, architecture and the city. And these series, our M Plus Matters series, are there to stimulate conversation, dialogue, insights, new frameworks, in our research. And research and scholarship is a central part of the work that we do. And we hope that it could feed into how we build M+'s permanent collection, our curatorial program, our learning and interpretation, how we think about the ideas of, and in this case, women and architecture and the city. The topic of women's role in the field of art and design production has been a subject of attention for decades. The issue of equity in gender representation across the arts has, however, been a more heated topic of discussion necessarily, and the action in recent years varied. As a 21st century museum of visual culture, we see the importance of addressing this issue. However, we would like to address it not with the intention of jumping on a bandwagon of feminism or out of political correctness. We believe that men and women have both played important, undeniably significant roles in contributing to culture and humanity. And there is every reason that these diverse contributions be represented in our collection, our programming, our discourse, our research. Yet, while reality encompasses the contribution of a wide spectrum of players, we also know that there have been barriers that has led to a less inclusive scenario. These could be barriers that have been the result of a lack of equal opportunities for work, barriers that have come up due to perception about women's contribution, barriers to acquiring knowledge of underrepresented women practitioners. For M+, these have led to harder work on the part of our curators to unravel documentation and the works of women practitioners, particularly in the field of architecture, when the profession has historically been dominated by male practitioners. The issue of representation is, however, only one aspect to overcome. We are also aware that there are other structural reasons why women architects have lacked representation and documentation, reasons which we believe are related to the limited set of criteria that we have been using to assess what is good architecture. So, today we are pleased to partner with Eunice Sung from Hong Kong U Faculty of Architecture, whose research into the histories of women architects in the region, beginning with Hong Kong, which very much complements our own work at M+, on uncovering and conserving the works of more women practitioners. Like the work of Wang Qihua, who I would like to acknowledge is here with us. Thank you so much for traveling all the way to this event, who has also generously donated a large part of her archive to M+. And through that process of looking closer, we also hope to develop a new set of criteria and methodology into how we assess architecture itself. So today we hope that our conversations on the life of work of 8 women in architecture will truly help us appreciate and value architecture in the fullness of its diversity. Who are these women? Minette De Silva, Wang Qihua, Julia Fung, Corinne Chan, Anna Wong, Winnie Ho, Joan Leung, Nora Leung, and Joan Lin Ao. And these conversations have been framed through the perspective lens of our interlocutors. And they are Tariq Jazil, Hussie Liu, Thomas Chung, Wallace Chang, Cole Roxham, Koon Wee, Clover Lee, and Marissa Yu. And I want to personally thank all of you for participating in this very important M+ Matters. Now, this event is also a result of a truly collaborative dialogue and project and relationship between M+ and Hong Kong University. And I'd like to acknowledge the work of 4 incredible women. From M+, Shirley Surya, our Curator for Design and Architecture, and Eunice Sung, the Associate Professor at Hong Kong University's Faculty of Architecture, who together this M+ Matters has been birthed. Supported ably by Noel Chung, M+'s Curatorial Assistant for Design and Architecture, and from HKU, Research Assistant Ina Wu. I would also like to thank all the participants who've come here from Taiwan, from London, and from Hong Kong for their time, their thoughtfulness to make this event possible. And of course to all of you, because we have to have audiences that are interested. We need to have dialogue and your questions as much as the debates and the insights that we will hear today. Thank you again for joining us today.
Just thank you all. Thank you, Suhanya, for the introduction. And I also just want to thank Dorian and Eco for supporting us with organizing this event. I just wanted to share really 2 points why Eunice and I have brewed this event since February earlier this year. And I just want to again reiterate my thanks for all of you to be here. It's a very tough time in the city, so thank you for your time and your attention to be here. So the 2 points that I want to share is really kind of aspirational, but I also consider them quite challenging, both to myself as a creator, but also to any individual or institution who mediates architecture and its value. And the first point really begins with the idea or the question of the who and the what. Who are the important women architects that as a museum and a research institution that we should actually pay attention to? What are the literature and the archival materials that document their work and which will help us to understand their work and define what is important to us for us to actually consider preserving or even disseminating? So this event, I think from day one, I always describe it as it's a project of visibility. In our preparation sessions with the participants, I often introduce it by saying that it is not a feminist project. While it's important to strive for equity in gender representation, we thought it would be more pertinent to learn of the documentation and then to also to acknowledge and then bring greater visibility to how these women architects have contributed to the city. And so the first session in the life and work of Minette De Silva in Sri Lanka, as well as Wang Chiu-hua in the US and Taiwan, is an example of what M+ has done and is doing to preserve, unravel, and to share knowledge of the life and work of pioneering women architects across Asia. And these include making Wang Chiu-hua's archive available for future access, as well as our digital editor making an entry in Wikipedia on Wang Chiu-hua. So while the remaining sessions for today with key women in architecture in Hong Kong, who are already or going to be part of Eunice Seng's long-term oral historical project, they will represent our beginning to uncover even more of these practices and ways in which we can represent them in our collection and our programs. The second point is about the how. So it's a question of how are we to learn about their life and work, especially when archives are either absent, fragmented, or even voluntarily hidden. Many women architects whom we came across actually have chosen to not share about their work. If we are aware of the existence of shared authorship, barriers to sustaining development in the profession, and also the idea of the full spectrum of design work that includes everything from the grand ideation to the menial tender submission, how are we to ascribe values to these very fluid and diverse practices of women architects, whose final outcomes may not have been valued in the same way as a type of photogenic or signature works that have historically been mediated and promoted by historians, popular media, and the design community. How do we begin to consider new research methodology, reference points, or even modes of representation in ascribing value and narrating the range of design outcomes that occupants may actually consider more impactful than the media? So I've sort of warned some of us who are coming today that there will not be anything too dramatic in our conversations this today. Dramatic here just meant, very signature works, and people all know about it. In that sense, I describe it as a series of discussions on the life and work of what some may deem as little people, little women, little architecture. Yet, what seems little, I also consider as fundamental, even baseline essential, in how architecture should contribute to nurturing communities and sustaining cities. So however one might measure value, validity, impact, or mass appeal of architectural ideas, processes, and built outcome, our little wish today is for me and for us as individuals, but also as learning institutions, to be able to reconsider some of the assumptions and the criteria we've used to assess what matters in the shaping of our built environment. So with that, I'll just invite Eunice to come and share with us about her research trajectory. Thank you.
All right, good morning. Rather than in lieu of an introduction, or rather specifically my research trajectory, am I loud enough? I do want to dwell a bit on, in fact, my introduction on this question of why. And perhaps by the end of the 5 minutes, you'll see that there's an ongoing, in a way, challenge as well as attempt to establish the how, the methods in which we research things that are actually incredibly complicated and difficult. Why are we having conversations about women and architecture and the city? If we look at the figure of the woman architect very closely, we will start in the same way as how architecture or architects have been discussed. We will look at how they dress, we will look at what signature work they have done, where they went to school, the very typical ways in which we would describe or analyze the value of a professional work of or professional. But let's zoom out a little bit and kind of think of them in a larger context. And I would like to take us back to the middle of the century to look at some of the very first in which some of our participants today were part of. So immediately after World War II, there is a across the board, and I'm specifically looking at the region at the moment, increasing attempts across Japan, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, etc., of women's being invited and given the right to vote. This is a historic moment, and this coincided with regionally and globally other geopolitical situations, like, for example, in 1949, the establishment of the PRC. And within Hong Kong, in the 50s, as many of us know, significant changes to the built environment. If we keep going, we'll see then other establishments and as well as the founding of the first architecture school in Hong Kong. And if we look across, also in the 50s, Hong Kong was not the only one. Hong Kong U.S. Architecture Department was founded in 1950, but if you cut across Southeast Asia, you see also all the way down to Indonesia that architectural schools and schools to study cities were beginning to emerge and establish. We get in 1955 the first batch of graduates from Hong Kong U. Out of the, I believe, 15 who graduated, there were 3 women who graduated as well. And we're going to see that trajectory, the ebbs and flow of women graduates as we go. And at the moment, we are at over 50%. So it's a kind of interesting, if we're talking about a rise from 5 to 50%, what are the kind of ways in which we begin to acknowledge gender rather than not to talk about it, but in what ways can we rethink that without also overstating the fact? Okay, if we continue going, in the late 50s, the first woman was registered, Edith Wu, in the then precedent to the Hong Kong IA, the Hong Kong Society of Architects. And we also begin to see a number of women instructors that appear at the University of Hong Kong. And we reach a peak in Hong Kong, and now I'm really focusing more in Hong Kong, but all these are interrelated to what's happening in the region, where across the board, and I will explain why there is a reason why it looks extremely messy, because it is, that there is the first magazine that was primarily dedicated to architecture and design, that invited Julia Fong, who herself is not trained as an architect at all, but a graduate of Hong Kong U, who found herself then participating and being an editor in that first magazine. And I'll talk a bit about her later. Then this was also a moment in which towards the end of the 70s, and at the cusp of, at the cusp of 1980, where the first issue of the magazine in the Asian Architect and Builder dedicated itself to discuss publicly the question of women in architecture. It's not moving. Okay. So if you begin to see that we have to start thinking about how to think about this question. If we start looking at practices, education, geopolitics, within and in the region, we begin to see that there are the ebbs and flows, and very much, of course, male and female architects are part of this evolving events and this dynamic situation in which we are still experiencing, and in which the woman architect, as you see, if you really zoom out, begin to present itself, and this is an ongoing project, as very much part of interrelated questions that pertain to not just the history of the profession, the dynamic situation of the profession, the education of the architect, but also conversations with the city. And throughout the day, we'll see today that in the conversations, you'll see each and every one of the architects and non-architects involved in the discourses and practices and education of architectural design and the arts are also themselves wearing multiple identities. They are mothers, they are children of mothers, they are possibly teachers, they are students, they are architects, they are members of particular clubs, Zonta clubs, they are friends of the museum, they are also on boards on education. So I think without further ado, we're going to start with the first session in which, in which we will begin to start discussing with our participants what architecture and the city and really their roles are throughout their life and their practice. And hopefully we will continue to be inspired by each other. Thank you.
Before I introduce Tarek Jazil to present on Manette de Silva, I just wanted to show some photographs or just some slides as to why M Plus is interested in Minette de Silva, and also some of the houses that we visited in Sri Lanka with ECO earlier this year. So this image here is a very frequently used image. If you could see Minette de Silva there sitting in the middle next to, I guess you can say, architectural giants, which is Siegfried Gideon, the historian, but also Walter Gropius on her left. And so this picture is really kind of showing like the fact that she's donned in a sari, kind of a very deliberate positioning of her, I guess, womanhood, but also being a South Asian. And so the question, and also being an architect at the same time. And so it's pretty much that positioning of this Asian woman architect. It's also the title of her autobiography, which is a book that is also on that table right now, out of print, but you could still get them from Sri Lanka perhaps. And this is a book that she wrote and published in 1998 before she passed away. And so it's the life and work of an Asian woman architect. So you could tell that this is how she wants to also position herself and also write about herself. If you were to look at the book, all the archives are driven to frame herself as a practitioner and her struggles and also her accomplishments. And so the question for us is that knowing that her archive is no longer available and it's all in a book, very fragmented in that sense, we had to check out her houses. And so these are just some of her earliest house. And it was what a lot of people actually describe as the first house by a woman architect in Sri Lanka. It's called the Karunaratna House in Kandy. And so you could tell here, just really dilapidated, not been occupied for many years. And that's just a little photo of what it used to be in its glory. And we just wanted to kind of show you this as an example of how Minette herself has really innovatively tried to design something that is a house built on split level, on a slope that is able to view out into the city and is able to be sheltered from the sun. All of these details, but also a combination of using materials like this glass brick wall as a panel between the study and the dining room, but also this very use of these arts and crafts of Sri Lanka integrated and embedded into her interiors. And so this is an example of this stairs balustrade that was using this Kandyan wooden lacquer and patterns. And so you could tell that even the decorative kind of like ventilation holes on the wall, and even this terracotta tiles that are actually casted from patterns that are in ancient castles and temples in Sri Lanka. And of course, the second house here is the Pieris house in Colombo itself. Similar treatment, the use of the bow leaf and the grill, and as well as the same terracotta tiles to line the entrance. And then at the same time, all these supposedly very traditional craft-based sort of integration into the architecture. It's also combined with a very modern way of building technology. And so this cantilevered roof on top of the driveway is actually designed or engineered by her friend Off Arup, so Arup Engineers founder. And so we just wanted to show you all these images as a way for us as to why we think this is important. And she's I guess many people have considered her to be the first to coin the term of what it means to build an architecture that is modern, but also for the region. So modernism, regional architecture. And yet, despite her pioneering contribution, it's not actually been as acknowledged compared to other architects that are in South Asia or other parts of Asia. And so, which is why we have invited Tariq to really talk to us about this occlusion of history, and also just to talk about his how he frames and why he finds Minette de Silva interesting in really as he researches into the post-colonial history of Sri Lanka. And so just a little bit of an introduction, which you can of course read in the booklet. I just want to mention that Tariq Jazil articulates a sustained interest in Minette de Silva's life and work and the eventual erasure of her contributions. His scholarly approach addresses the ways in which de Silva's work illuminates the relationships between the politics of Sri Lankan cultural production, everyday life, and mid-20th century anti-colonial nationalism. And so he has published very key publications, including Sacred Modernity, Nature, Environment, and the Post-Colonial Geographies of Sri Lankan Nationhood, as well as post-colonialism and subaltern geographies. And Jazil Tariq is coming from London. He was a professor of human geography at University of College London, where he also co-founded and directs the Center for the Study of South Asia and the Indian Ocean World. Welcome, Tariq. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much. It's great to be here. I'm not unaware, of course, of the irony that in a workshop on the underrepresentation of women architects, I'm a man giving the first talk in the first session, so I apologise for that. I'm genuinely privileged and delighted actually to be here for this this workshop. So thank you for the invitation. I look forward to participating in and hearing the conversations as they unfold today. So thank you for inviting me. Thank you for the introduction, Shirley. Thank you, Eunice, as well, and Noel, and Suhanya, and everyone else that's been involved with today. So I was invited, as Shirley said, because of my work on Minette De Silva, who is, of course, as we've already heard, Sri Lanka's earliest tropical modern architect, really. She pioneered the style in a career that spanned from the late 1940s through the 1990s. But as many of us will also know, and we've also heard just now, she's frequently overshadowed in discussions of Sri Lanka's architectural modernism by a significant architectural heritage industry in Sri Lanka that fixates on the architectural genius of her more famous male counterpart, Geoffrey Bawa, in particular. Whose earliest commissions, actually, Bawa's earliest commissions in the late 1950s were a full 10 years or so and 18 or 19 builds into De Silva's own practice. Now, to focus on De Silva then, which is what we're doing, of course, the Sri Lankan style that I think Minette De Silva helped to inaugurate adapted, as Shirley said, adapted elements of international modernism to Sri Lanka's own tropical environment. She trained at London's Architectural Association, graduating in 1948, and through her involvement with Siam, was in touch with many leading modernists, and famously, of course, including Le Corbusier, with whom she enjoyed a close relationship. And incidentally, there's a kind of parenthetical note that I want to make here, which is that her relationship with Le Corbusier is the subject of this recent novel, actually, by Shiromi Pinto, called Plastic Emotions. I'm not sure if anyone's come across this novel yet. It was published just this year. And the novel really is a speculative piece of fiction on Minette's relationship with Le Corbusier, her relationship come affair with Le Corbusier. Now, I guess the parenthetical note that I want to make here is that it's interesting to me that one of the few published books on Minette De Silva is this mostly fictional account that, in my own reading at least, seems to kind of place her in a quite peculiar relationship with Le Corbusier. And I guess what I mean to emphasize here, without commenting on the novel itself, is that that same license to speculate in print and in public on the architect's emotional and intimate life doesn't seem to get extended to other male Sri Lankan architects, including Bawa, who would seem to have had a very interesting and colourful private life as well. So I think there's a kind of interesting point to discuss here, but perhaps about how the female architect's life becomes the kind of property of the public in particular kinds of ways. But anyway, De Silva's tropical style offered her a method, I think, for responding to the cultural homogenization wrought by colonialism. And it's a style that grew in popularity in 1950s Ceylon, especially Colombo, given an emergent demand from Ceylon's upper middle class. Now, my interest in De Silva's work has been part of a broader project, as Shirley said, a broader project on Sri Lankan tropical modernism, including De Silva's work, but also Geoffrey Bawa's work and other contemporary Sri Lankan architects, that over a number of articles, and in this book on the left-hand side of the screen, Sacred Modernity, that was published in 2013, traces the architecture's politics in the context of Sri Lanka's ethnicized conflict. Now, with respect to Minette De Silva and the article published in the journal Fabrications, that's that article on the right-hand side there, Tropical Modernism and Environmental Nationalism, I wanted to try to delineate some of the ways that she sought through her architecture to embrace the Sri Lankan environment, Sri Lankan tropical nature, and in so doing, to try to show how this kind of aesthetic effort was implicated in what Minette De Silva and other modernists after her regard as an avowedly post-colonial architecture. So one that she intended really as a break with 19th and early 20th century colonial architecture. But I've also argued in that book and in these articles, I've also argued that despite her rather ambivalent relationship with more violent strands of anti-colonial late 1950s Sinhala Buddhist nationalism, De Silva's modernism helped, I think, to create something like a crucible, if you like, for the expression of these more violent political articulations, right? So to be clear, my argument here was not and is not that Minette De Silva was in any way or in any sense any kind of a Sinhala Buddhist nationalist or chauvinist. Indeed, she firmly believed, I think, her architecture to kind of transcend formal politics, to be a kind of well, a sort of modernist conceit, I guess, of art for art's sake or architecture for architecture's sake. However, the broader sweep of the argument is that Sri Lankan tropical architecture has in fact been one of those aesthetic domains that has fashioned the historiographical and environmental narratives of post-colonial Sri Lanka in ways that have enabled the logic of ethnicized political violence. Now, I'm going to briefly elaborate on this argument, not because I think it's important in the context of the conversations here today, but because actually in doing so, what I want to do is sketch some of the methodological challenges that working on Minette De Silva raises, actually, which I think is of more interest to us here today. And in particular, I want to emphasize the difficulties, really, of working on an architect who's been largely neglected in the heritage industry of Sri Lankan tropical architecture. Eclipsed, as I've said already, by the very prominent figure of Geoffrey Bawa, who's become something of an icon for this kind of post-colonial Ceylonese architecture. And of course, I think that the canonization of Bawa, himself an upper middle class male architect, doesn't just happen, right? Architectural histories are, of course, written. They're produced by architectural historians. So, in this sense, part of what I want to suggest is that Minette De Silva's relative obscurity in this context has, in some senses, been produced by Sri Lanka's architectural heritage industry, if we can call it that, which emerged, I would speculate, or I would say, in the mid-1980s, but gathered pace in and around the 2000s, when, in particular, David Robson began publishing his very beautiful and excellent, I have to say, series of Thames and Hudson books on Bawa. I'll come back to Robson if I have a little bit of time later, but the result of all this, I think, is a rather, I guess, historically perverse situation where De Silva's considerable and foundational influence and genius is continually refracted through the male figures that, in reality, I think her work would have inspired, actually. I'm going to focus here on a house that she designed in Colombo in 1954 for the Umrasingers, an upper middle class Sinhala Buddhist family. Now, like much of De Silva's work, the house was demolished in 2011, and what remains of it are textual fragments in De Silva's 1998 autobiography that Shirley's already referred to. There's a copy of that book over there, actually. Now, the fact that much of her work has been demolished, I think, is symptomatic of the ways that she's largely been forgotten about. And it raises important questions also, I think, about the value of built space and how the value of built space is retroactively produced in a wider textual and political economic field that we might want to think about in relation to women architects. And I guess I'm thinking here about how the canonization of architects like Geoffrey Bawa in Sri Lanka retroactively attaches value and permanence to their buildings, just as the work of those who aren't canonized devalues their work and in turn, I think, makes it more susceptible to the neoliberal vagaries of the wrecking ball. So the absence of a material record of her work means that De Silva's autobiography becomes an incredibly important resource for any scholar of her work. It's at once a kind of scrapbook, a diary, coffee table book, compilation of her work and other fragments. It's part Bildungsroman, it's part portfolio. Equally committed to documenting family biography, a history of Sri Lanka and her intellectual concerns. So it's chaotic, it's difficult to follow, but also a kind of treasure chest, really, I would say, full with De Silva's iterations, thoughts, ideas, and glimpses into her main influences. And until the publication of Shiromi Pinto's novel earlier this year, it was, I think, as far as I'm aware at least, the only book out there on Minette De Silva. So it's a valuable document, not just because of its descriptions of buildings long since demolished, but because of its collected ephemera as well. And as one of my good friends and colleagues, the architectural historian Anuradha Ayasidiki, has written, the book is valuable because it's one of those rare cases of a fish describing the water in which it swims, which I think is a great expression. Now, this kind of architectural deficit this kind of archival deficit is, of course, a familiar crisis in women's histories, and one that feminist historians like Antoinette Burton have long identified and sought ways around by invoking the value of domestic and private archives, diaries, family histories, etc., for the telling of women's histories. And I think Minette's book is precisely that kind of document that enables us to locate her practice in a wider, expanded field. And for me, it became an invaluable tool of mapping the intersection of her tropical modern architectural practice with what I referred to as forms of environmental nationalism. So it enabled me to trace how her vanguardist tropical architecture became entangled in an ethnicized spatial politics of nationalism that helps consolidate ethnicized power. Through a kind of environmental refrain that, whether I think Minette De Silva wanted to or not, positioned non-Sinhala others, Tamils, Muslims, Burghers, as guests to be tolerated by sovereign Sinhala hosts. And to make this kind of argument, I attended in the work as much to the things that De Silva and others said about her work as I did to the work itself. So methodologically then, and as Shirley said, I'm a geographer. Right, so methodologically, it's fair to say that I'm less interested in architecture's formal qualities and more so in what architecture does in and through the world, right? So my fascination is with what the architectural theorist Tony Vidler has referred to as architecture's expanded field. And I situate De Silva's tropical modernism within a broader set of cultural, ideological, and ultimately spatial processes, I think, that reveal much about the politics of post-colonial nation building in which the dominance of the Sinhala Buddhist ethnos was emerging. Now let me illustrate this by speaking to a short passage from De Silva's book where she narrates the Amrasingha house, a typical kind of inside-out, outside tropical modern house. Now off the property, she writes how, I'm going to read through this quickly. House walls are pierced with openings influenced by traditional, economically designed air vents. There are few solid walls. The main structures carried by reinforced concrete pillars with reinforced concrete slab floors. The enclosed walls of louvered or sliding doors and windows, or wood or wrought iron trellises, direct every available air draft into the house. The roof space is utilized as an attic study. Note the niches for pahanas. Notes the garden courts and house flow into one another. Materials, flat slab and column structures, woodwork, jackwood, polished, colour, light cherry, sliding doors and windows. During the Pirit ceremony, the priest made us all laugh as his sermon consisted of consolation for the Amrasinghas as their house didn't appear to be finished. Of course it was. He just didn't think there was enough decoration or walls to hold the thing up. Now, instead of asking what kind of building De Silva describes here, I've chosen to dwell instead on the expressions, the tensions, and the anxieties I think that the quote reveals. And the first thing to stress here is the presence of a number of different textual communities. So first of all, we have De Silva's clients, the Amrasinghas themselves, a middle-class, professional, nuclear family, both Buddhist and Sinhalese, though not implicated in the more populist Sinhala Buddhist nationalism of the mid-1950s. I think it's interesting that they requested De Silva build a shrine room into the structure, which is not really, I guess, an explicit articulation of religious nationalism, but a symptom of the growing normalization of Buddhist aesthetics in the formal capital, the former colonial capital, Colombo. Second, the priests and monks invited to bless the house, who represent a public institution, the Buddhist clergy, of considerable power, and who institutionally were far closer than the Amrasingers to populist nationalism. Third, of course, there's De Silva herself, the architect, with her own sense of modernist sensibility. And fourth, the text implies a reader, of course, right? The you or I reading about the Amrasinger house. Now, I want to suggest that reading this quote requires us to dig just a little more deeply into De Silva's work. Now, her writings from her London period, 45 to 49, betray her own awareness of her own, I guess, what we would refer to as exoticism in the professional spaces of the Architectural Association. Again, Shirley's already referred to this in her introduction. Yet they also suggest a certain kind of confidence in her ability to renegotiate modernism because of her own difference. And it was this architectural double consciousness, I guess, that proved central to the translations of modernism that she felt a responsibility to help forge back in Ceylon. So though the universalism of Le Corbusier inspired her work, it was in fact Patrick Geddes' work in India that offered her an inroad towards what would become for her a genuinely Ceylonese form of architectural modernism, particularly Geddes' notion of conservative surgery, which advocated for modern improvement sensitized to the roots of regional culture. Now, in conservative surgery, De Silva saw a roadmap for a new vanguardist Ceylonese architecture, offering what she thought was an avowedly post-colonial departure that walked in step with Ceylon's political ambition towards independence. So conservative surgery held the potential to concretize a rupture between the standardizations of colonial architecture, a rupture with the standardizations of colonial architecture, and in so doing, it anticipated many local iterations of modern architecture across the world. But of course, De Silva's relationship with colonialism was quite complex because it was colonialism's class structure that enabled her her own architectural training in the UK. So despite these breaks with colonial architecture that she sought, she also abhorred the more obviously anti-colonial nationalist, Sinhala Buddhist revivalist style that was gaining traction in Ceylon at the time. And this to her was antithetical to the secular, the functional promise of architectural modernism. So she sought a style that looked for a suitably deferential break, I think, with colonialism, able to bring Ceylon's architecture and thus Ceylon into modernity on its own terms. Now, it's for this reason, I think, that her description of the appearance ceremony at the Amrasinger House is at pains to distinguish her thoroughly modern architectural sensibilities from the priest's fear that the house didn't appear to be finished. So I think there's a sort of performative kind of distancing of herself from his uncomprehending remark. And in so doing, she betrays a certain kind of teleology, I think, that the house embodies in that sense. Now, formally and technically, De Silva brought this movement away from colonial architecture. She brought this movement along by building space that recuperated a relationship with Ceylon's tropical environment. So put simply, she worked to open out the colonial bungalow, breaking through the constraints of colonialism's imperial universalisms, and in the process, building space more suited to living with the superabundant tropical growth of the local environment. So her architecture drew on design elements from Ceylon's varied past to accentuate this. she began to regularly use internal courtyards, for example, which has become something of a design staple in the tropical modern house in Sri Lanka. And in the Amrasinghe house, this enabled rooms to open directly into a secure interior outdoor space, offering transparency and clear lines of sight. And the effects were this kind of fluid and liquid inside-outside spatiality. But crucially, features like the internal courtyards were architectural motifs common across a varied palette of historical Ceylonese building practices, including Sinhala, Moor and Dutch housing, but De Silva narrated them as Kandyan Sinhala devices, the Medu Midala, indicating, I think, how her formal architectural techniques, tabled as quintessentially national, were imaginatively mobilizing an ethnically exclusive sense of Sinhala tradition. And this was all done in the midst of rising populist Sinhala Buddhist nationalism in the 1950s. She was also keen to use local vernacular building materials, and she chose materials that could bear the environmental stress of weathering, thus enabling the house to imprint itself, enabling the outside environment to imprint itself on the house's inside. She'd sparingly also use antique ornamental materials, which signified, I think, a desire that her structures extend out into the time space of the nation-state beyond. And her ornamental choices invariably drew upon histories of Ceylonese classical arts and crafts, usually from the Kandyan region. They created, I guess, kind of stretched affiliations with an imagined pre-colonial history and geography in the post-independent nation-state. So though De Silva's work was inspired by the likes of Le Corbusier, her conservative surgical approach powerfully articulated cultural difference, and this was her success. She was responsible, I think, for buildings that, as Fred Jameson has put it in his diagnosis of critical regionalism, reaffirmed the regional national culture as a collective possibility in its moment of besiegement and crisis. So, as I've been suggesting, for De Silva, Ceylon's tradition and historical identity were located in the island's Kandyan Sinhala heartlands. Most of her techniques, most of her materials were framed around the Kandyan Sinhala tradition and history, which in turn, I think, thus instantiated the primacy of the post-colonial national thought retroactively as Sinhala Buddhist, in a context where this was the very same claim of populist, ethnically exclusive nationalists. So she was influenced by the preeminent art historian Ananda Kumaraswamy in this, whose 1908 monograph, Medieval Sinhalese Art, called for a modern revival of the Sinhala arts and crafts tradition. And this was a text that became part of the ideological terrain of an emerging nationalism, actually. And De Silva was also strongly influenced by her close association with Sri Lanka's modernist movement, the 43 group, painters like George Keat, George Clason, Ivan Peiris, who were developing their own aesthetic response to colonialism, forging a distinctively Ceylonese artistic modernism that combined European modernist trends with Orientalist themes that spoke to Ceylonese particularity. Now, looking once more at her description of the Amrasinghe house, it becomes easy to see these Sinhala Buddhist striations of De Silva's tropical modernity. So the house is narrated in ways that position it to and amongst its users as an essentially Buddhist and Sinhalese structure, albeit a thoroughly modern one. So for De Silva, the house is replete with an aesthetics that's coded Buddhist. It's thus sacred, but not in the tradition of institutionalized and formal religion that the Buddhist priests and monks represent. And this is the point, I think, right? As much as the materiality of the house itself, it's the house's narration. It's her anxious humour at the priest's uncomprehending remark that helps the building's sacredness into modernity. So here, in the Amrasinghe's modern tropical house, the sacred ceases to be a counterpoint to modernity, just as the non-secular Sinhala Buddhist nation becomes modern on its own terms. Now, as I said, this political argument is less important in this context than some of the methodological points that I hope to have raised in this short talk. and this in the context of a broader discussion about female architects whose work and influence has largely been concealed by the gendered and patriarchal squint of architectural history writing. And I guess there's 3 points really that I just want to draw out very finally. First, I hope to have elaborated on something of the method involved in locating Minette de Silva's work in what I've referred to as architecture's expanded field. And that's a phrase, as I said, that I borrowed from Tony Vidler, who borrows the phrase himself from the art historian Rosalind Krauss in her work on sculpture and expanded field. And really the point here is about suggesting and thinking about how architecture is always situated in the world, right? It always must be thought about in relation to the broader cultural field. Secondly, I hope to have spoken a little bit about the value and the necessity of going to unconventional archives, in this case her book. Reading them also across the grain, critically engaging with those archives. And this, I guess, is an approach that takes much inspiration both from feminist history and subaltern studies historical scholarship. And I think, just to come back to one of the comments that was made in the introduction, that the aim today is that this is not a feminist project, but a project of making things visible. I think in many senses, many feminist historians or feminist geographers would argue that a feminist project is about making the work of women visible, actually, right? So there's an interesting conversation to be had there, I think. And thirdly, I guess, importantly, I hope to have shown something of how, in the case of Minette de Silva, working on her absence is as important as working on her limited presence in the history books. So in other words, it's immensely productive, I think, to think about exactly why and how her presence has been effaced somewhat from the history of Sri Lankan architecture, because it means that we have to see her in the context of, I think, the immense intellectual labour and industry that's created the kind of architectural heritage industry in Sri Lanka as it is, right? And I'll leave it there because I'm way over time. Thank you.
And I think, just thank you, Tarek. I think you raised some really key questions or issues on just really the methodological kind of like or challenges in really studying or understanding what her life and work of Minette. And so I just wanted to kind of like find out a little bit more about your thoughts when you first encounter this book, her autobiography, and the idea that it is such a subjective construct of herself, and yet you're still able to embrace it as a text in which is going to inform, I guess, your core knowledge about, or a core narrative about her. So I just wanted to kind of understand a little bit more about, were you skeptical about it, or just that process of reading this very much self-construct, I guess.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It's a really, I don't know if anyone has seen this book or read through it. It's quite a bewildering book, actually, because it's really chaotic. It was published in 1998, actually published posthumously after her death. And it really is. It's quite a remarkable book because it really feels like things thrown on the floor that have just then been published. So in that sense, it takes a lot of work, I think, and it's one of those books that it's almost like it does feel very much like you're going through an archive. I'm not sure if this was your experience when you read the book as well. And insofar as it does that, I think it really is a useful book from a historical perspective or from an intellectual perspective, because it enables, what it forces off you as a reader is a very active engagement with the text. And I think that's really important because it makes you think about Minette in relation to what was going on at the time. It's a very contextual book. You can see the workings of her process, of her mind, the things that were close, proximate to her when she was in the process of the various building projects that she talks about, the people she was in conversation with. So I think, from a historical perspective, it's a really incredibly useful book. There's a great article by Anuradha Iyer Siddiqui on Minette de Silva, and it uses the book and it focuses on the book in some really interesting ways. And I think the book for me is most useful when it's considered as a kind of fragmentary source, actually, that really kind of enables you to locate her in this broader field. So its value is precisely in the way it's so unpolished, actually.
But I still wanted to ask, would you still compelled to find other sources apart from what she presents about herself? And how successful have you been in finding other sources about her, or is it,
Yeah. So when I was doing research for the book, in particular, I did a lot of archival research in Sri Lanka, looking through particularly newspapers, actually. And I was interested in the kind of newspaper coverage of architecture as it was produced at the time. There was a lot of that kind of archival research that was incredibly useful. And of course, here's where that third point in my final 3 points becomes relevant, because not much was written about Minette de Silva. There was an abundance of material at the time, and other architects, including Geoffrey Barber, but not much on Minette de Silva, some. But then what I also did was I interviewed not just architects, but I interviewed people who had commissioned houses from these architects, and I was interested in that process of living in these buildings, what people wanted, what they imagined and dreamed and fantasized about when they commissioned and worked with these architects, and what that process of working with architects like Minette de Silva was like. So that was an incredibly fruitful experience, actually.
So was there a revelation of gaps or I guess conflicting stories to how she presented herself based on your other findings?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I'm not really entirely sure how I would characterize Minette's presentation of herself. It's kind of rare that you see her own voice, actually. And even in that book itself, it's very difficult to discern her own voice in some senses. But no, I mean, I think not so many conflicting stories, but actually, what was interesting, and this was not specific to Minette, but most of the people who I interviewed who had worked with architects to commission a house of some description, and I'm aware that I'm in a room full of architects here, but most of the people I interviewed said it was a really difficult process working with architects, because of that negotiation of the architect's own design, image, etc. And of course, as a client, you're paying for a house, right? You're paying for a design, so you want some input into that process. So I didn't find that there were many conflicting stories. No, and Minette's working relationship with her clients wasn't out of sync with other stories that I heard. No.
Thank you. So yeah, I just wanted to ask if anyone has any urgent questions.
Yes, thank you very much for presenting about de Silva. I'm a very fortunate person because she is my teacher. I think it's the first year when she come to University of Hong Kong, and I am a student in her class. So I never know she did all that. I know so little of her. And my experience is she didn't even once mention what she did. We all know she has some kind of relationship with Kabul. Well, that's something, little gossips. That's all we know. And she taught history of architecture, and she never talked about her work. We didn't even know what she did. We know she graduated from AA, but nothing about what you did. So it was really eye-opening to finally know my teacher. Really. And the thing is, finally I know her. I came here because I want to know her, even after she died. And I wanted to share a little bit side story of what I know her as a person, as a teacher, which you didn't cover. She her eye glows when someone did well in her class. I did one assignment that's very good, and I got an A from her. She was so happy, and I was so happy. I didn't get A so easily from other class. But her class is difficult. Not everybody take the class seriously because it's history of architecture, and we all focus on studio work. And one thing you didn't cover is we all know she contributed to the book, Fletcher's History of Architecture. That's something she mentioned, her only little contribution there, and we know. And I after knowing about this talk, I tried to research about her too and get to know my teacher. After so many years, we never know her. And I found out that, reading initially, discovering what you cover, those houses, it was demolished, it actually makes me feel bad. It wasn't recognized. And I stumbled upon an article that mentioned that she also did the Candy Arts Center, which is still standing. And it was a beautiful civic piece of work, which I never know my teacher did that either. And it's surviving, and it paints a picture that something that she did was successful and it still stands. And sometimes I told, my friends, architecture and architects is very interesting. Even when the architect passed away, their work stands like for a long, long time beyond their life. And it seemed to kind of capture their life in certain way, extending beyond that human existence. And I also read online after researching about my teacher lately that people always connect the women to the men they know, like Corbusier. That's the only thing our classmates remember, I guess. And or either she's connected to his family, which seems to be pretty well off and influential. But nobody focused on the women themselves, And when we talk about them, sometimes we talk about the unfortunate side, which links the story and seem to be, we will be emotionally attached. Oh, she didn't do that well. She was overshadowed by men. I hope your further research will bring out the success of her, not overshadowed by either other people or family or whatever. Because I think we wanted to honor my teacher in this way, and I wanted now to switch my mind to remember her. She suddenly grew taller. She's actually a very small lady, by the way. She's very small. And when she's teaching me, of course, she's already much older. It is in the 1970s. I was in that class. But I'm very happy to have participated in this event, and I come here to learn more about my teacher, and I did. But I wanted everybody to know that she's a very passionate teacher, and her eye glows, every time somebody did well in her class. And I wanted now to remember her as a different teacher to me now. She has grown much taller, Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So with this, we'll move on to Wang Qiuhua. Thank you, Tariq, and thank you for sharing that. It's a very personal note.
I hope you were recording that for the archive.
Yes, the whole thing is documented.
Fantastic piece of oral history there.
Yes. Yep. Thank you. So I just wanted to. So I just again before we go into the next session of really talking about Wang Qiuhua's practice. So Wang Qiuhua is what many have called to be the mother of libraries in Taiwan, but of course it's much more than just libraries. I just wanted to share a little bit more about the process and what the 4 lessons that I learned in acquiring Wang Qiuhua's archive. And so it's just 4 small lessons and photographs of my interaction with Wang Qiuhua since 2015 about what it means to really, really kind of the thoughts that kind of come through our minds as curators as we acquire these things. And so the first question here is really about a lesson is really about the hidden archive. And so I think we mentioned before about what you mentioned. Not every woman architect wants to tell other people about their work. Sometimes they chose to not talk about it at all. And so I think I had to mention, I have to be really grateful to Wang Lao Shi, for really sharing her work with us. And so when you go to her house, she has all these photographs of her work in the States, and we're all just wondering what are those, and there's no book about her. And I think even up till now, she refused to publish her memoir publicly. So it's only shared to her friends and families. And so that aspect actually makes it, the question of like, how do we get to know? It's very hard. We don't really get to know. I'm sorry, I have not been talking to the mic. So yes, I will talk to the mic now. And yes, please stay there. Okay. And so there's the first lesson, the lesson of the hidden archive and how it takes the person to really initiate in revealing herself. And so these are just pictures about her as she, oh yes, I think I have that book there, I have a drawing there. And so it's that, and then I have a box of slides of all my projects in the States, or even, slides of models of libraries in Taiwan. And so it's just this sort of process. I think it's over about 4 to 5 visits that we slowly discovered this. And I have to mention Xiaoping here, which is really the person, which is a former colleague of Wang Qiuhua, who really helped to organize all these materials for us to be able to acquire and actually tell our registrar this is what we are acquiring. And so it's a long process in that sense. And then the second lesson is really a lesson on authorship. Authorship here really is, a lot of people say, okay, do we have the signature on the drawing to say that, Wang really designed it? She's always associated with Percival Goodman, this very kind of architect in the US, that she was working very closely with. So who designed it really? Is it really her? So all these questions come up, and I think over time, after especially, so I just wanted to kind of to show that hard hat of Wang Qiuhua, and you could tell on the hard hat, it said C.H. Wang Architect. It's just her own personal hat next to her desk in Taiwan. And that's a portfolio of projects that she and Percival Goodman did together. So the question of single authorship versus collaborative, kind of an autonomous practice versus collaboration, is something that I think we have to embrace both. And in our justification of why we think that these projects, even though they are collaborative with Percival Goodman, it is just as something valuable for Wang Qiuhua to be partnering with him in designing some of the very important modern synagogues in America. And so I think in her little memoir, she mentioned before that Wang Qiuhua, she's much more of a plan, designing the plan and the floor plans of the building that really informs the final structure. And even Percival Goodman had to kind of like take his hat off and let Wang Qiuhua really resolve the spatial planning aspect of these buildings. And so even when I go through the drawings with her, she would be able to talk about every single detail of these buildings. And so the question here is, isn't that a proof of authorship in itself? Even if the final signature is not the person. So I think it's just a question that went through my mind. And the third lesson is really appreciating architecture with a small a. So this is not a performance art center. It's not a parliament house per se. It's libraries. It's primary schools in New York, and it's drawings that it's not a form that is gestural in that sense. But when I saw this drawing, so this is of a library in Changhua. And I just saw the people that going down the steps, and how the library itself is next to an open courtyard, and how her kind of attention to wanting to allow readers to be accessing the outdoors and light and nature and all that is really part of what she thinks is important. But of course, this is not gestural architecture that is meant to be completely of mass appeal and everybody knows about it. But this is just as valuable for us as a museum. And so it's a question for us because this is the first time that we encounter such works. A lot of museums tend to acquire altered works and very highly mediated works, but this is the first time that I learned about these projects. And so I think it's a process to realize that there is important value to be ascribed to these projects. And so again, steps, for Queensborough Community College, or even the little ventilation holes to actually ventilate non-air conditioned libraries in Hong Kong, in Taiwan in the early 80s. And we saw this little book there. It's actually Henry Dreyfuss Manual for Designing Furniture. And it's next to her desk, and just how much detail she went into designing every single furniture in the library was really about this attention to detail, but also attention to the usage of the object and the space itself. And then the last lesson, and after that I will pass it on to Xu Liyu. It's a lesson on gender. And so gender here, to me, never really kind of became a prominent issue until I encounter Wang Qiuhua. Because for us, okay, just look at good architecture, right? Just look at it, just find it, and then bring it to the museum. But when we encounter her, it was almost like, it's not the same kind of issue. There are other questions to raise. And there are other challenges that she may have faced that may not be the same as everyone else who may be dominating like male architects. And so, but Wang Qiuhua, when we asked her, was there any difference that you always wear a qipao to the construction site in New York? Chinese wearing qipao in New York? And she said, oh, well, actually, no, there's no difference. There's no problem at all. As long as you're able to be humble and be good in what you do, you will earn respect. So again, we just posted a little blog 2 days ago, and you can read more about what she said about that. And so again, this is a photo of her being one of the few female students in Columbia Architecture School. And then this is her in a qipao exactly in an entrance of Center for American Studies in Taipei. And so yeah, so that's the 4 lessons I learned, and I just wanted to play this very small video that we did. It was interviewed 2015 after she fell down many times, and we were afraid that something might happen. And so we just wanted to share this with you, and after that I will introduce you, Li.
我在美国大部分时间都是穿旗袍，所以有一些我到工地去，
他们都吓到了吧？
没有，他们就说穿旗袍的建筑师来了。建筑师多半是男人做的事，我妈妈就说，也许你将来可以嫁给一个建筑师，你可以帮他削铅笔。我在哥伦比亚念2年，第1年的下半年的时候，我就跟 Goodman 说，我不想只念书，我希望有一点工作的经验。他就叫我到他办公室，我就到他的办公室。我父亲很早就希望我回台湾。那个时候，我父亲是中央研究院的院长，所以他就觉得在院里面应该有一个机构是研究美国文化。这个房子我是不希望再恢复古式的中国建筑，所以那个图书馆是一个很重要的因素。我尽量用的材料跟周边的房子相似的。红砖跟灰瓦，那个时候就做了9个研究室，而且都很小。斜屋顶2个原因：第一，排水比较容易；第二，有一个斜屋顶就可以多出一个走廊。也是有一点学火布，因为这些水出来，它不会直接从墙上过去。我那个时候是很崇拜火布。这块地上本来是一个2层楼的住宅。我做这个房子的时候，我自己比较喜欢的部分就是我的楼梯。我是把这个柱子，只是一个8公分的铁的柱子，从地下室延伸到8楼，那个就是整个楼梯是用那个支持的。我这层楼只有2个卧室，因为只有我跟我妈妈2个人。所以我就多出的空间，把它做一个室外的空间，因为我觉得我妈妈出门都不方便，就我希望她可以在室外做一做这样。这个我的小画廊有一个特别的用处，它的末端呢是一个高起来的 clear story， 它在屋顶上面，所以我在夏天呢，台湾很热的时候。我在那里做了一个特别的风扇，然后那个窗子的那个百叶是可以开的，所以我开那个风扇，整个房子都会很凉快。我本人本来就对图书馆有兴趣，就在初中的时候，我们学校有一个图书馆，只有2层楼，也不是很大。那个图书馆也认识我，因为我是唯一一个每天要去的，就下课去那里，就站在那个书柜旁边看，不舍得走。那个管理员有时就过来拍拍我的肩膀，他说：“小朋友，你可以坐到椅子上、沙发上去看。”我说：“我自己站着看，我就走不开。”采光的部分最重要。 我们是希望从北面采光，也不会有影子，因为没有空调，你就一定要有自然通风。我们把窗户都做在每一层楼的最高的地方，每一层楼都是从最下面有风进来，然后到了顶楼就可以把这些热风抽走。现代建筑，我是觉得，第一，这个建筑一定能够满足这个业主的需要。我不管它式样怎么样，我必须第一能够做出来这个空间是合用的，是能够达到他们的目的的。
I will introduce Xu Li right now. She'll be sharing more about her own take. So just a background of Xu Li. Xu Li is an architectural educator, but also a practicing architect in the studio called ARMU. She co-founded WAT, or WAT, and that is Women in Architecture Taiwan, an association that really focuses on raising the visibility of women architects in Taiwan by documenting and publicizing their life and work. And so Li recently just recently just edited a special issue on Wang Qiuhua's work, which I think she will give away to some of the speakers today. She also had received her Master of Architecture from Yale University and PhD from National Taiwan University. And so she's really both a practitioner, a writer, editor, but also quite an activist. And so welcome. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, hi everybody. 接下来我会用中文说明，因为我想我这样子的话，王老师如果我讲错了，他就可以指正我，我讲错了什么。那首先呢，非常感谢 M+。我所谓的非常感谢，是我们在台湾的女建筑家们，非常感谢 M+，花了那么长的时间，用心的去整理研究了王老师的作品，然后并且妥善的收藏他大部分的档案，让我们有机会可以更深入的去认识王老师。那我今天要分享的其实比较，因为等一下我们有机会可以跟王老师谈比较仔细他的作品，那所以我今天要分享的其实是我跟王老师之间的这个投射的关系。那我先讲不可讳言的是，其实从建筑史，特别是显著的现代建筑史，都是以比较所谓的先锋派，追随先锋派的主题就是 pioneer 的方式去看，并且一再强调这些 pioneer 的所谓的光芒，导致一般人甚至所有的人其实不太容易看见身边经过的这一些美好。那我今天的这个题目呢，其实也是从王老师身上来的灵感，叫做行者。先讲，其实王老师，我们会称他为王老师，是比较亲切的称呼，因为我们比较觉得可以从他身上学不少的东西。那行者其实是我们比较会在中文里面会去讲那个有知识的、先行的，就是实践者。那当然，我们同时也会讲说行走者。为什么会用这个词来开始分享我跟王老师之间的一个投射的关系？当然，也从一个他的作品的细腻来谈。那我跟王老师的认识其实很晚，就是大概可能是在 M+ 开始收藏王老师之前的一小段，我们为中原大学、东海大学一些台湾的建筑系的毕业生做演讲，因为那一年的题目谈的是建筑女力。那其实我个人是非常排斥用建筑女力来谈，因为仿佛女力就变成是一种很特殊的格外需要花一点什么样力气去注意的事。但是这是我第一次跟王老师碰面，所以照片里面我们两个人看起来都很年轻。那我要讲的其实是，现在我在因为女建筑家学会的关系，所以我们开始逐渐的去花一些力气去了解前辈建筑师做的事情。那当然我们要想一个方式如何去看，而不是又重新做一个 pioneer 的一个方式去走，可能我们就很难去谈这些女建筑师在她的年代、在她的时代里面究竟能够做什么。那么因此我先说行者 也就是行走的人，其实他能够看见的环境是非常的美，而且非常的有它的秩序。环境这个关键词，也是我跟王老师在谈的时候一再感受到他强调的环境。那环境跟建筑的关系是什么呢？我自己在做我自己的工作的时候，我曾经画一个这样的图，跟一个机构谈我们如何修一个房子给老人家去使用，给社区的居民去使用。我就说建筑很简单，就是有一个土地，有一个它原本的环境，以及我们必须要提供给人们一个遮蔽体，然后把我们喜爱的这个环境放到这个室内的环境，如同在室外一样，然后并且赋予它绿色的生命，让它生生不息。那这个也是在我跟王老师认识这么熟之前，我也在想这个事。认识他之后，我突然觉得我好有勇气哦，原来这样子也可以是一个成为建筑师之路所去努力的事情。所以我就在想，成为建筑师究竟是一个什么样子的事？很多人会去讲说being architect的意思是 to create， 可是我觉得在王老师或者是在我自己选择走的那个不是那么形式化的事情的时候，我发现很大的任务其实是 to complete， 不管是 to complete 这些人们所需，或者是 to complete 那个环境所不完美的部分，建筑其实可以让它完整，可以让在那个建筑里面的人完整。所以我觉得这个好像是一个很不一样的价值。那么我再进一步去了解，其实王老师他曾经有一次跟我讲，我问他说，王老师，你觉得女建筑师跟男建筑师有没有不一样？然后王老师就跟我摇摇头说，没有不一样。然后他就讲说，他曾经在1977年的时候受邀到纽约参加一个女性建筑师的一个作品展，他当时带了一个作品。那我就记了很久很久之后，为了要做这个10月份的王秋华的特辑，我就再问了王老师说，王老师，你再跟我讲细节一点，1977年是什么样子的状况？他说1977年他受邀展览的是中研院的美国文化研究中心。当时的展览是一个建筑师，他跟一个他实际完成的作品一起参展在纽约。那么我们就在想说 OK， 同时成为一个建筑师跟当一位女性，她究竟在经历什么？那最近我们其实也有一些年轻人把王老师的访谈影片做了1分钟的简介，参加的纽约的影片展。因此女性就变成了现在其实大家会比较关注，想要从她身上看见什么，看见过去遗忘的什么，或者是我们疏漏了什么。当然这个又回应到我们可能还是会在寻求一个所谓的 pioneer， 但是我必须要说，这个 pioneer 的定义，在我们试着看见建筑中的这一些女性所做的事，她在想的事情，她的时代的时候， pioneer 的定义开始在改变了，她再也不全然是只是英雄般的光芒，它开始跟所有的人类产生关系。那这个是我们在整理那个王老师的特辑的时候，我试着做一个简单最基本的表格，一边是把他的生平一边照时间列起来，另外一边则是一个建筑师在做的事。没有错，他多了一栏，他会跟很多的跟其他的建筑师合作一些案子。那这也就是刚才 Sherry 讲的，其实他也在挑战了关于传统的这一些作者作品论的这个关系。他开始去讨论建筑师跟作品本身的关系，难道真的是个人的吗？或者是我们如何在这个作品里面去看见这个属于王秋华建筑师的这个部分，它的关键影响力是什么？那么我们其实正确来说是我其实是在王老师的家里面看见最多更接近他本身的思想跟做法，有很多的细节合在这个房子里面。那对我来说，王老师他的示范最重要的是，建筑师他不会只是盖一个最外面的壳给别人看，他其实会细微做到光， 做到你的休憩的树印，甚至做到你必须要，而且你很享受的那个日常作息，他会把它做进去。他的家就是这样。那他有一个很美丽的名字，叫做明月前生。啊，那大家想，这个明月前生的意涵是什么？王老师是在8月8号生，这个明月前生是他父亲给他的一个笔名。那我一直在想，这个名字好有学问，可是这个学问是什么呢？我觉得，如果大家仔细走在月夜，尤其是月圆前的那个夜晚，你去看，月光是照在你眼前，所以明月前生其实是一种启蒙照在前面的那一道光芒，所以让你知道你怎么走到你的路。所以我觉得这个笔名实在是也太有深意了。那这个是我们的替他做这个特辑的时候，我们下的一个标题。那事实上，这个标题是王老师为他的老师古德曼建筑师翻译《看见理想国》的那一本书，他所写的一个作者的一个序，应该算是译者序。他就说，他遇见古德曼建筑师，最重要是他开始懂了建筑是什么。那他认为什么叫做建筑？他开始懂了呢。他说，所谓的启蒙，是因为建筑的专业的社会意义。启蒙是建筑专业的社会意义是什么呢？他开始懂了，建筑是具有社会意义的。那这当然也是引发了后来，我其实也在比较这一代的女性建筑师，包含像林徽因、修泽兰、王秋华建筑师，台湾还有一些王秀莲这些同期的1910、20、30年代的这些建筑师，都特别具有社会性。他们所做的事情，其实相较于当时的现代建筑师，他其实更多他在照顾人，为公众服务，甚至当一个老师。那我们当然讲说，他讲建筑师的职责不止于美化环境，他更需要以促进社会改革为最重要的目标。社会改革听起来的这句话，感觉起来非常的伟大，社会改革。可是事实上，王老师他讲的社会改革，我觉得更重要。我感觉到的事情是，做一个老师，做一个以身作则、言教身教的老师，他用他的作为，不求名不求利的方式，告诉你，建筑如果单纯是一个设计房子的建筑师，就把房子做好。如果你做一个老师，尤其是建筑系教建筑的老师，你可以告诉人家，建筑可以为人们带来幸福，可以让他的生活满足，以及我前面讲的 becoming an architect， 他是要成为 to complete what complete others， 去完成其他人的梦想 ，just like the way she is， 就是我们认为他示范了一个最好的先行者。如果这个是一个很美好的 pioneer 的一个新的定义，我相信这是我们今天最开心可以看到王老师他来到现场，让我们可以见到他，听到他所讲的。所以我们现在欢迎王秋华王建筑师。王老师，你要跟大家讲点什么吗？先讲一点，嗨。王老师，你还记得说，我们说今天我们来香港，然后我有问你说，那个你有没有来过香港？你印象中的香港是一个什么样子的城市？
我来过香港很多次。我最初到美国的时候，每一次进美国都是经过香港进去，所以我来过香港大概10年左右。
10年，
嗯，
那你印象中的香港10年前的样子
？10年前是很不同，完全不同。后来香港变成了两层楼，那你
就是公路蛮多的嘛。
对，所以你很容易在上面一层就可以去到每一个地方。
那我印象中你讲的是说，香港还有一部分就是香港人，他跟城市的关系跟今日不太一样。
因为我很喜欢香港， 因为我觉得香港的人都很公开，就是很容易跟人家谈话。
王老师，你记不记得你有一次第一次1964年跟那个古德曼建筑师有做过一个都市设计 Manhattan 的设计？
对，你再说一次。
就是跟那个古德曼建筑师有去参加一个那个纽约的都市设计竞图。
哦，
您可不可以谈谈那个竞图你当时在想的那个路？
那个是我第一次参加的，在台湾的竞图，那是做
不是，我说的是那个很早以前古德曼建筑师不是有在法国杂志刊了你们的那个竞图？
那个是很久以前，那个时候我刚刚从大学毕业，后来就到哥伦比亚的graduate school。那我是在这个哥伦比亚碰到了一个 Percival Goodman 老师，他是一个非常好的老师，因为他不但只是教我们建筑，他也跟我们讲过很多整个西洋的一些文化历史。这个我从前在学校的时候，我中国的老师都没有讲到的。
我记得王老师你讲说那个我们谈到建筑史教建筑史的时候，你说当时中央大学教建筑史的时候，讲西洋建筑史也好，中国建筑史也好，有一个最大难懂的问题是，他们不太能够讲社会的状态，所以不太好懂。
中原大学的图书馆是我在台湾做的第一个主要的一个工作。
这个是古德曼建筑师的书嘛，对不对？
那是我的教室。
这个刚才 Sherry 有讲说，这个是你同学画的，那个同学就是教室里的样子。
土耳其的同学画的。
然后这一本是古德曼建筑师的书嘛？
这本书是很重要的一本书，是 Goodman 和他的弟弟合写的，后来翻译成国际的其他国家的语言，也翻译了11、12次。那么
它里面内容主要是讲什么呢？
它主要是讲，因为那个时候美国就是盖很多很高的房子，商业的建筑，他不赞成那些商业的建筑，所以这本书主要是讲，你看啊 ，means of livelihood and ways of life， 就是说你要过什么样子的日子，然后你可以赚够了钱活，那个是这本书的最主要的最主要的
所以其实他们当时就已经蛮先进的，在讲社区的价值，生活的区域应该要有什么样的品质。
对。
那这一章你还记得吗？
这个当然就是我们在
学校
评图的情形。
这个当时那个王老师，你在纽约哥伦比亚念书的时候，班上就只有一位女孩子，就只有你是女孩子吗？
对，我是班上唯一的一个女生。
那大家有觉得这样子的关系有什么样子的学习上的差异？
美国人就是这个好处，他不管你是女生还是男生，他也不会歧视你。
那跟古德曼建筑师合作，其实大家印象最深刻的就是做犹太教堂。
对，
这个是
Goodman 先生，他小时候因为家里头出了事，没有受过很多教育，但是他在18、19岁的时候，在纽约赢到了一个大奖。那个时候，法国 在纽约每一年组织一个大奖。Goodman 大概他其实小时候，因为他父亲走，把全家有6个小孩，父亲就说他自己去发展事业，就不见了。那怎么办呢？那他妈妈他妈妈是一个画家，他也不画了，他就到一个百货公司去找一点工作，但是家里还是有4个小孩，从2岁到12岁，所以他妈妈就找他的一个姐姐，搬来合作，就住在他们家里。他这个姐姐就管小孩，非常的严厉。这个 Goodman 是第三个小孩，所以 Goodman 就离家出走，因为他不能忍耐他那个阿姨的管的方法。那幸好那时候他有一个舅舅，对，是他妈妈的兄弟，有一个建筑师事务所。那时候他只有13岁，他只可以去跟他们做一个小弟，就是送东西，或有的时候描图。可是后来他的那个舅舅啊，就觉得这个小孩是有相当的天才，也送他到纽约的一个很有名的一个学校，去学了一点画图方面的知识。
王老师，我想问你啊，这个是你跟那个古德曼建筑师做的第一个教堂，
对。
然后这个你还有印象哪一些部分是你做的设计吗？这个后面，
你要不要让我？
好，这个按这个，
其实
按这个。
这个主要的教堂是，我不会指在底下的。
这个，它跑掉这里。
对，这里还有这边
还有这2个教堂。
这个部分其实是 Goodman 设计的，但是我那个时候在肺病疗养院，但是我在肺病疗养院也在床上画图，我就跟他设计了有30个学生，还有一个大的教堂在左下室，
这里
左边，
这里
左边，
这里
再上来一
这里，
对。
所以这个部分就是教堂跟这个
那个
学校，
对，那个教堂只是给学生用的，下面那个教堂和礼拜堂那个才是给一般的民众用。
可能，但我补充一下，就是犹太教堂它其实是一个很特殊，他们有3个教派。那当时那个古德曼先生是属于改革派。那这个教堂它有一个主要的大教堂跟小教堂。那这个大教堂、小教堂是它正式的礼拜跟一般平常那个会众来，他可以在小教堂这一边做小礼拜，或者是做他的那个沉思跟准备。那王老师讲的这个部分呢，则是这个礼堂跟这个学校给这个教信众们的小孩们来学习的，对吧？
是。
然后，所以其实接下来我们会看到王老师你们的那个犹太教堂有不少其实的设计都要讨论到犹太人的社交，50几个嘛。50几个教堂的设计，其实有蛮多都是要兼顾它的既有的宗教的那个礼拜，然后还有平常日的这一些社群社交活动，他们的这些社群。这个案子您还记得吗？就是您做过最大的犹太教堂在底特律。然后这2个，您当时最神奇的做法，说他这个礼拜堂如何从这样子的一般的1500个人左右，到它可以扩充到3600个人的这种大礼拜。
这是我们做过最大的一个教堂，因为一般的教堂，犹太教堂 总是有一个问题，就是平常去的人不是一定很多，但是每一年到他们过年的时候，犹太人过年的时候，就会去很多的人，所以平常我们都是垂直的方向给它加一些位置，但是这个太大了，它要加3600个人，那么所以我们想了半天，只有中间的是平常的。
只有中间这一区是平常的礼拜，然后两边这个是可以扩充的。
那个两边平常啊，在那一边呢是可以请吃饭的，在下面这一边是可以演讲的，所以是平常的教堂也都有这几个function，就是说除了教堂以外，他们的教员喜欢在一起吃饭，所以一定有一个很大的餐厅。同时呢，它这个大的教堂，它另外也做一些演讲，所以一边是演讲，这个真的是很不好做，而且你看，事实上你也许看不大出来，这个两边的三角形的房子，其实它的地板呢，比中间的房子高1米，所以它而且有一点坡度，所以它就都可以看到主教堂的一些活动。
他可以看到这个主要的这个礼拜的祭坛这一边的活动，
对，
所以这个才是这个造型很特殊，你们花了很大力气去做。有一个部分是王老师你们做的教堂特别漂亮，有很多艺术家跟艺术作品有参与。
对，我们的教堂跟其他的教堂最不同的地方，是我们根本很喜欢现代艺术，所以他一定都是尽量的找一些现代艺术家合作。可是有些建筑师，有些艺术家已经很出名，那我们的业主就请不起，所以我们就到戈德曼先生他认识一个卖画的人的库房，他就让我们到库房里去，我们就在那个里面去找比较年轻的而且有希望的艺术家，就来跟我们合作。然后等到我们做出来之后，到后来那个这些有名的建筑师，我们的业主都请不起。
所以从艺术来看，你们也做了蛮多的。当时纽约的公立小学，尤其这些公立小学的位置，它都是在比较是黑人区，然后可能社经地位比较低的弱势、相对弱势的这些小学。然后，我想我们比较好奇的是说，当时你有讲到92。就是公立小学92号公立小学，
这是一个公立小学。
对，当时你不是说，这些小学生不爱自己的学校，
而且公立小学，因为我没有在美国上过小学，所以我要做这个小学以前，我就到纽约全城去走了一圈，我看着，第一我看着很奇怪的，所有的小学都一样的，后来我才知道。纽约的小学，它是归一部分的教育局管，它教育局有2个办公室，一个办公室呢是做这个小学的 program， 就是说这个小学要多大，是念什么样的书，而且他一定选一部分的学校出来，尽往从一个实验的方式，有不同。一般的小学，然后有的时候，有的学生可以在2年级的时候就到5年级去念算术，但是他其他的时候他还是2年级的年龄，所以他平常的课还是跟他2年级的小学同学一同上。
王老师喝一下水，你讲好多话，我一直拷问王老师。王老师喝水，我补充一下， 就是当时那个古德曼建筑师跟王老师做了很多公立小学，那这个也是纽约市当时很多用小学去做一些社区的一些改造跟那个照顾这些孩子。那57号小学其实是他们有一个比较特殊的是，它是实验教育，就是协同教学的方式，所以它的这些那个建筑物的配置，它就安排像刚才王老师讲的，有一些孩子他有一些不一样的状态，对不对？所以他就要可以有不同的区域可以去。
那个时候他那个做这个小学内容的时候，他们就尽量想走一个实验的方式，所以他们后来就不是做一个一个的教室，只有这1年级跟2年级是有个别的教室，其他的学生他就有3、4个大教室。这个大教室里头的隔间也有可以有隔间，那是活动的隔间，可以拿开就可以做一个很大的空间，大家一起讨论。而另外呢，他就在这个学校里有一个另外一个讨论室，就是有些学生实在是有问题，在很多人的聚集在一起的时候问不出来，他就跟学生做仔细的讨论。
所以就是在这里嘛，就在这个学校里面，它这些教室有一些角落就是大一点的是他们可以协同教学的这种，好几个可以隔起来不同小组的，然后也有一些教室是让情绪或者是有其他问题的孩子，他可以有另外一个空间冷静下来或沟通嘛。所以后来王老师，你最经典，我印象最深刻就是我第一次遇到王老师在一场演讲上面，王老师讲了这个 QCC、这个阶梯阶，
这个是一个很特别的情形。那个时候我已经1970年代，那个时候纽约出了他的高等教育局出了一个新的规定，就是任何一个大学要开始的时候，它全校是一个什么样的计划，要经过高等教育局核准，然后你不可以随便去改它。那个时候呢，我们拿到的这个工作啊，它是已经有一个2000人的大学，在纽约的 Queens， 就是它的东边的区域，在那个2000人的大学的时候，那个学校啊，第一它离了捷运站跟公车站都很远，所以所有的老师跟学生就都只能开车去上课，就有点像我们后来的社型大学、
社区大学。
对，它并不是给什么特别的学位，但是你就是说帮助你已经是成人，也许你在小时候没有机会好好的受教育的话，就到这种学校，说你出来之后你就可以直接到社会去做事。
所以当时为什么会决定做出这个大阶梯，然后跟这2栋建筑物是这样子的关系？那
他当时我们的只给我们做的小学，它是在原来一个废弃的高尔夫俱乐部，所以它是在一个山坡地的地形，它的东边比西边要高8公尺，所以呢，那些它比如说它体育馆跟学生的餐厅在上面，其他的教学空间在下面，但是呢，那个你春天、夏天还可以爬上去，但是冬天下雪的时候，那些学生就没有办法上去，所以我跟他们设计了一个坡道街，
这个
就是这个，你看，
就是这个
坡道街，对。我是这很容易走的坡道， 也中间也有一点
阶梯平台，
对对，所以
学生就可以像这样子坐在这边，
对
弹吉他，
对，
吃午餐。
但是你看在前面啊，在前面
这个
从学校一进来就是行政大楼，那个图书馆在中间，再过下来，
再下来。
对，我们从学生到了行政大楼报到以后，就可以从房间里面直接上一个大楼梯，出来就到图书馆的2楼。它因为是个山区，所以他们的图书馆是有3个进口，1楼、2楼、3楼，但它的主要的进口就是我们做的行政大楼的中间。
这个主要的进口是这个吗？
对。
所以它其实两边的建筑物，就是它人们学生可以是这样穿越的，那它也可以进到行政大楼之后，从主入口出来一个大平台，然后它就可以往下走、往上走，还可以走到另外这边的教室。
对，我们也在这个坡道的旁边种了一些植物，就把垃圾桶是放在植物后面，所以那个学生家是在室外吃午餐，就脏东西可以丢在那个垃圾桶里。
所以王老师，我还记得你说这个就是学生活动中心啊。
对，
就是这个大阶梯所串联的整个可以活动的空间，它成了一个无建筑物形体的活动中心，让欢迎社区也可以进来的空间，把整个大学串起来。
本来我学校问我们想设计一个什么房子，我说我们想做一个学生活动中心，是可以请当地的居民也来一同参加。我说，但是那块地已经用完了，我们找不到地，所以后来我做了这个大坡道，这个大坡道就变成了他们的学生活动中心。你看到很多学生啊，就是很喜欢在那个上面。
这里就是坐在上面。
对对对。
那这个其实是您刚才有讲到，您父亲，这个中央研究中研院，
那中研院是比较早一点，1970年代做的。
我记得是1971年的时候，你们就有了草稿，然后你在台湾对这个。
最初的
这个最初的是这个图，后来你改成这样。
最初的计划就不行，后来我就到台湾去看了。那个他这个基地旁边有一条很深的河，而且每一年台风季节，那所有的水都会满出来，就倾到旁边的这个稻田。我们那个房子就在那个稻田里面。所以我们那个时候，我就想一定要把那个
房子抬高，
房子就是房子的入口离河越远也好，同时就把它从地上抬高，就是它淹水的时候还是可以用。
这个里面的这些这个就是您刚才讲的这个斜屋顶，然后空气可以热空气往上飘，
对，
所以室内的这个图书室它就会比较凉爽。
这是他们这个研究图书馆，
所以这是你第一个在台湾的图书馆了吧？这个也算是你第一个在台湾做的图书馆，只是它是研究中心的图书馆。那这里面的这些家具。都是王老师您做的吗？
自己做的。
所以你就是从那个时候开始，所有的家具都做。这个是就最有名的中原大学，也是我的母校。对。
后来我就把我自己的建筑方面的书，我都送给中原大学了。
王老师，我特别留意到你很会做一些空间位置，是让这些图书馆里面的学生可以坐到窗边，光线会进来。
学生很喜欢的，在
这些
单人的一个
桌子
在窗旁边，因为我们把所有的玻璃墙的底部都是用钢丝做的，就是可以进气，不能够采光，可是可以进气。 但是那个窗户很高，是吧？那个上面那个
这个
窗户，
开不
这个窗
到。
户是可以开的，但是你看，它太高了，所以学生因为学生有一个毛病，有时候他们会把书从窗户里丢到室外，然后到外面去捡。但是我们那个窗户因为很高，
他就没办法丢书了，
他没办法丢书，
没办法从里面丢书，
对
跳过去不是就算是也是一种雅贼啦，偷书。
然后我们都是因为那个时候中原大学也很穷，而且不是中原，台湾政府就
台湾整个经济都
那个时候
都很穷
台湾政府的规定是，这个图书馆里的工作人员，比方说是有一间小房间，它是可以用空调，但是图书馆就是学生用的地方，不可以用空调，不可以用空调，因为他们那时候没有那个钱，所以我们就。
所以你的意思是说，学生坐在窗边，他底下有通风口，脚会凉凉的，
这叫
就很喜欢坐在窗户边这样。
对，你可以
原来
看到那个坡面，你看
这个坡面，
就是那个气啊，都从底下进来。
这边，
然后我们在屋顶上放了6个抽风机，它就可以把这个热气抽出去。
我后来当学生的时候都是全空调了，所以我就不懂得什么叫做脚底下会凉凉的，坐在这里。
后来台湾比较有钱了，而且很多人已经习惯用空调，他们没有办法说不用空调，所以他们就加了很多空调进去，就把我的天花板弄得一塌糊涂。我也没有办法。
难怪后来王老师你还要再回去帮忙修2次3次这样，还要捐钱修。我们学校真穷。
我后来回去，其实并没有改建筑，是改它的使用的方法。因为从前呢，所有的学生要查资料，那个参考室里面都是摆满了书架，他到书架上去查。到后来，大家都是用查卡的方式，所以我们就跟他加了36个查卡的桌子，有的是六个人一桌，有的是个人一桌，所以他们这个就变成真正是一个现代的图书馆。
其实从图书馆的检索嘛，就是他们检索放以前。书库型的是要写一张单子，去跟小姐柜台说我要拿这本书。
对。
那你本来做我们中原图书馆就已经是开架式图书馆了，
对。
可是后来开架式，大家还是有一个找书的问题，以及现在我们开始用电脑了。所以你第3次帮中原大学我母校做修的时候，其实就是修让他们可以是电脑查询的那个台子嘛。
我在做中原大学的时候。台湾的国家图书馆，那时候是在准备，我也是那个馆长的顾问，所以我就同时要跟这2个地方要做3000张椅子，阅览椅，我把它画出来做，然后因为我那个时候也在台北工专教书，那个台北工专的有一个主持人是我的一个表妹，她就把这个书按照德国那个包豪斯的方法，把它分成了3部分，一部分是建筑设计，一部分是家具设计，一部分是产品设计。说这是一个很好的方法，当然。我们没有做得很成功，不过我们是尽量做。
刚才肖老师，刚才那个王老师讲的是，我们有一个台北工专，也算是日本时期就有的一个职业学校。 然后萧老师，也就是王老师的表妹，那她当时在战后的时候是台北工专要成立建筑科的时候，她是当时的系主任，然后把当时的学校是分成3个组，就是建筑组，然后家具设计组、产品设计组。那王老师当时回来到台湾的时候是1979年，然后就到台北工专任教。那所以他刚才讲的其实是，我现在终于知道，我们中原大学母校的图书馆的椅子其实是跟国家图书馆的椅子是同一批的，对吧？同级的。突然觉得最穷的大学的图书馆是国家级的椅子。
是。
好，王老师，你还有好多图书馆，像这个是那个彰化师范 Sherry 最喜欢的这一张图。就是你几乎好像就是那种大阶梯坐到图书馆里面去，你在做什么？
这是另外一个这个图书馆在彰化
师范大学，
国立的经济学的一个大学。那因为彰化的天气很温和，出太阳的天也很多，很少下雨，所以我就希望给他们一些户外的，这个。
那这样我们就不用担心他们会偷书嘛，就是要从窗户丢出去，这样就在里面，反正平台公有也可以捡嘛。
我们做这个图书馆做得很辛苦，做了4年了，有4个不同的馆主，有的馆主呢，他不许学生在户外看书，我觉得很可惜。后来最后一个是一个女馆长。他是允许学生到外面看书，
才有机会
而且他又把地下那一层改成了一个咖啡厅，所以那学生就很喜欢去那个。
那这个好奇怪哦，这个怎么不是图书馆？这个案子长得很可爱。
这个是台北市
国科会的精密仪器中心。
精密仪器中心，因为那个时候。台湾也是开始在做精密仪器，但是他们还在研究怎么样子利用，怎么样子发展。那我们就其实做了3年，第一年只做了这一点，然后后来再加了后面，
然后第3期是这个，
像你看
这个是第3期的吧？
那些圆窗户跟那个烟囱。
就是这个，
那个是，就是有一些学问，就需要是化学方面他需要的东西，所以我觉得很高兴，我很喜欢这个。
我先讲一个插话是，其实我们很多人就是不太懂为什么王老师特别喜欢这个案子。那我也好巧哦，我以前也做了一个工厂，然后我突然懂了，这好难做。你知道工厂最麻烦的就是很多的那种它的排气的烟囱或者是排气孔，它不是建筑师说，你给我排在那里比较漂亮就可以，不行，它就是要在那个位置，要不然就不能用嘛。所以做这个最难。我记得你跟我说这个案子好难做，因为那个平面如果这种所谓的内部的工业使用、研究使用的平面，它内部不能用。
按照你要怎么样用这个房子，你就怎么去做它。
所以才会有这么多可爱的这些烟囱，它不是装饰的，它全部都要接到内部的 function。然后我就跟王老师说，我终于懂了一句经典的话，叫做 form follow function。原来这个形式跟它这个里面的 function 其实是完全密合，建筑师超难做到。这些里面的研究人员、工厂所需要的实验室这些设备，它都完全能够合用，还可以做这么可爱原创。
是。
所以我们终于要看到你可爱的样子了耶！对啊，这个好可爱哦。可是我们都问不出来你这个时候在干嘛？疗养院，你举这个。
我在刚去美国的就是刚刚要到哥伦比亚毕业的时候，我就发现有肺病，那个肺病的菌是很可能很多年以前在中国几乎没有小孩，他们检查那个肺，就说几乎没有小孩没有被 肺病的细菌
感染
是感染，但是有的是比较身体好一点，他可以挨得过去。但我有好几个很好的朋友，他们都是后来就少念了1、2年，然后再毕业上去。
所以这个是你在那个当时休养肺病的时候被一个摄影师拍的，只是完全不记得为什么会有这么可爱的动作，对吧？然后这一张也是您也很多才华哎，又会弹钢琴，又会打网球，然后又可以
我是很喜欢打网球，不过我在
我问王老师，你最喜欢的网球的那个？
我是和
陈少平是 partner。
陈少平。
对，王老师，你最喜欢的网球球员是哪一位？
我非常喜欢打网球。
你固定都要去看那个温布顿网球赛吗？
我是固定去看，每年每4年有一个网球大赛是在纽约啊。我没有一次不去。后来他们问我去过多少次，
没有一次不去，那是去过多少次呢？
我去过44次。
所以王老师，中间这个是你1973年来台湾监造中央研究院美国文化研究所的时候的样子啊。那个时候你就这样穿着旗袍，跟大家看不到凉鞋。
1973那个时候我已经是做了很久的建筑师。
然后你那个时候到台湾待了3个月，去盖那个房子，美国文化研究所。
对。
那有没有人说，哎呀，一个女孩子来了当建筑师，哦，我们不太能够相信她，会这样吗？
不，纽约的好处，他不管你是什么样的背景。
那你来台湾的时候有比较不一样吗？
我刚来台，我真的是1937年才从美国搬回台湾。
1979。
1937，因为那个时候台湾也比较前进了。
所以也没有这个问题嘛。所以其实人家也都是工人，跟你的关系很好哈。
对。
然后你都可以问他们怎么说怎么做。
我刚到台湾的很麻烦，因为我不会说台湾话，工人也不会说普通话。
那这个工地要怎么办？
就是反正你勉强说一说，也可以过得去。
好，我们要讲说，我们工地都有工地台语，寸球下，王老师你听得懂吗？寸球。
什么？
好，确定听不懂。好，没事，没有。好，最后其实王老师，我觉得我们还是要回应一下大会的这个故事嘛，就是大会有一个主题，你1984年台湾有一个建筑与女性的座谈会，然后那个时候你还很认真的座谈会完了之后，还写了一篇那个会后的有感，有一句话你还记得吗？这个什么，我们虽不必追求功名，你还有印象吗？
那棵大树是我用一个avocado 的核，那个放在水里面，它就开始出芽，但是那个核很特别，它出了7根芽，我还把2根剪掉，它还有5根，它就越长越大的。我就慢慢把它从小盆换大盆，换泥土，它真的是有8尺见方。而且
这棵树听说坐了2个人的位置。这一棵树啊，在你纽约的办公室啊，坐了2个人的位置。
对。
所以古德曼建筑师就说你要做3个人的工作。
对。
然后你平常就这样在公司在事务所就这样穿着旗袍。
对，我那个时候很多美国的工人都叫我一个穿旗袍的建筑师又来了。
所以最后其实我们这边上面夸的这句话，就是我刚才想要问王老师，其实这句话是在1984年的时候，台湾的那个建筑师杂志工会第一次办了一个建筑与女性的座谈会， 那王老师也是受邀的一个很重要的贵宾。那他当时在他的会后的一个文章发表在《建筑师》杂志里面的最后一句话，他说：“我们虽不必追求功名，也必须平等而公开的参与自己所能做的工作。时代与社会都是人造的，也是人造的，不会永远不改变的。”所以这句话，其实我跟王老师讨论，也跟 Sherry 讨论说，我们觉得很适合是王老师送给这一次的论坛的一个很重要的一段话。就是其实这里面也不分男女，虽然前面的故事是有分的，因为它前面也是从历史来讲，女性虽然相较从教育来说是比男孩子晚进到建筑的工作，但是女性一直都在，然后他们只是比较专注沉默，没有特别讲什么，但这不等同于他们不在。所以接下来王老师说，所以我们虽不必追求功名，也就是我们也没有要求什么大名大放，但是我们是平等而公开的参与我们能做的事情，并且去做一个时代与社会观念的一个改革跟改进的努力，这个是每一个人都能做的。所以这个我们已经不是只是我们，是我们大家。好，这是不分的。所以谢谢王老师。我们现在请 Sherry。已经超过了。
谢谢王老师，谢谢许丽瑜。其实我们时间已经到了，可是我还是想给一个机会让观众问一下问题，可以吗？有没有人有什么给王老师要问的问题？Any question from the audience? We just want to give a chance before. Okay, please.
您会觉得就是这样有点可惜，或者是以后就是
用的人如果
对
改变了你的设计，你会不会觉得这样很可惜？
那我没有关系，只要他是往好的方向改革，我并不反对。
那你觉得就是如果留给使用者自己决定，还是我们建筑师帮他们就把它进行全盘的决定，你会比较倾向于哪个方式？
他是问说，是给用的人去决定那个东西应该要长什么样，还是建筑师要把它都做好？
不是我觉得当然你是考虑这个用这个地方的人是有什么样的需要，我觉得这个是最重要。所以有时候是有的建筑不容易做，比方说，假设你要做一个医院，你当然是要为这个病人着想，可是很多医生有很多意见，他的管理人员也会有很多意见。如果你要做一个住宅，比方说那个卖房子的人，他有很多意见，他又是要考虑这个房子是不是可以赚钱，卖得出去。所以你光跟他做一个你觉得是好的住宅，不是那么容易。
但是还是要努力做嘛。建筑师好的建筑师还是会要通盘的去听各方的需求，做最正确的决定，还是会把它做下来，做起来。但是你会允许使用者，特别是用的人，真正会去用的人，他能够适合去使用。
对，你一定要考虑一个使用的人。你做一个学校，你一定要想那个小学生是怎么用它。
我们先举那个例子哦，其实可能我觉得这样帮王老师解释。他刚才讲到小学，就是我们刚才有一个投影片谈到美国纽约的那个92号小学，公立小学。当时王老师讲一个重点，学生没办法爱学校，所以他们在设计的时候做了一个很大的突破，希望能够用政府给学校的公共艺术的基金，去让学生，就是小学生的艺术作品能够坐在空间里，而且是让学生去做。这个部分就是希望参与。可是在公立小学92号的这个案子没有成功，因为市政府不同意。可是他们可以邀请艺术家去把那个艺术作品做出来，然后建筑师勉强就是折中，让小朋友可以做这个事。可他们发现这个事情小孩子是不够快乐，使用者没有真正的跟那个他们的设计扛那个在一起，所以在后来的3、4、5的那个公立小学就成功的，上面的这些艺术作品是小孩子的艺术作品，所以他就逐步的 真的让那个落实。所以当人跟他的那个建筑可以有一定程度的认同跟参与的时候，就是刚才王老师讲的，使用者的需求不会只是一个所谓的我要用几样东西吃喝拉撒，他有一个认同跟情感的事情，他必须要透过他的参与能够连接起来。那这个也应该是王老师讲的，建筑师也应该考量进去的一种设计。它不一定是一个形体的设计，而是一个过程的设计，也必须要设计进去，对吧？
是我们做第一个小学的时候，那个是在纽约的黑人区，黑人区后来更新了也很好，这是在更新以前。我们就想，我就看见在那个区域里头，很多房子并没有破窗户。但是小学有很多破窗户，我想，大概小孩不喜欢他的小学，他就丢石头，打破那个窗户。那个时候纽约的规矩是，他每一个小学他都有一个管理员，那个管理员，假使你有破了很多窗户的话，他就会发包找营造师来修这些玻璃，但是他不能说1、2个窗户都会找一个营造师来做。那我们这心里想，为什么别的房子没有破玻璃，可是小学有这么多破玻璃？我想是因为你小朋友不喜欢他的小学，所以我们想，我们要想法子，我们做第一个小学，我们说。我们要想法子做什么，让小孩喜欢他的学校。那个时候纽约有一个规矩哦，他的预算里面有2500块钱是给你做学校的一个公共艺术。那时候我们就想，公共艺术，当然你要是一个公共艺术家。也要得到那个小学的容许，你可以做。我们那个时候就想了一个方法，我们是找了一个很好的建筑师，他就我们就是让他把小学的那个图画，
你找了一个艺术家，把小朋友的图画做成那个瓷砖，让
他
们可以贴上去。
他把那个小学生的图画选出来，又做成了一个。烤成瓷片，就可以把它贴在餐厅的墙上，而且每一个小孩有自己的签名。我想这些小孩，而且是看见他自己的画在一个重要的地方，他们会喜欢他的学校。可是那个时候纽约的小学，他有一个设计跟施工组，他不许我们做。他认为儿童的图画不能算公共艺术，
不能算公共艺术。
我们跟他争了很久，也没有办法，反正就不让我们做，所以那个学校后来没有做成，
是后面的才有机会做起来。
后来就比较好一点，后来的，而且那个做这个学校内容的那个办公室。我们去看跟他那个教授讨论，我觉得他们就容许有的时候可以去做一些犯规的。
好，那王老师最后有没有什么还希望能够送给现场的人的话？因为我们的时间也差不多了。
我想我们的人一般的人还是不够注意。我们的人造环境，我觉得你这做一个房子很漂亮，也没什么了不起。可是我觉得人造环境，事实上是建筑师一个很重要的义务，所以我们一定要从这一点开始去考虑。
谢谢大家。
谢谢王老师，谢谢玉瑜。Thank you for the meaningful dialogue. We're going to bring Eunice now to introduce the second session. So.